Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming this evening for the Performative Book Reading and Cyberfeminism Index. Hopefully you're in the right spot. I'm Emily Garner. I'm the Senior Manager of Campus and Public Programs here at the MIT List Visual Arts Center. And I'd like to thank you all for coming to this year's Lavine's lecture. The Leroy and Dorothy Lavine Lecture Series was established in honor of the Lavines, two prominent Boston art patrons and longtime supporters of the MIT List Visual Arts Center. This lecture series features distinguished art world speakers and presenters and serves the Boston arts community through its focus on modern and contemporary art. I also want to thank my colleagues here at the MIT List Visual Arts Center for supporting this program, and specifically Cassidy Westjohn, the program coordinator, and Rebecca Pinhals, who's a volunteer for Cambridge Science Festival. So this year, Lavine's lecture is also in collaboration with the Cambridge Science Festival and the MIT Bookstore as we're hosting this program. If you registered for the program, you should have received a coupon code to receive your 30% off for the text. If not, we also have coupons at the back of the room that you can grab on your way out if you didn't get one on your way in. So tonight, with the Cyberfeminism Index, this text looks at the past 3 decades of online activism and net art, critiquing the histories and futures against networked patriarchy, and celebrates through over 700 short entries of radical techno-critical activism. Some can consider it a canonization of feminist net art and new media art, and some consider it an anti-canon of sorts. The book could be considered a piece of conceptual art, as well as also could be considered a resource guide. But regardless of how you consider it, it makes visible cyberfeminism's long ignored origins but expansive legacy. So I'm pleased to introduce Mindy Sue here to share this legacy with you this evening. Mindy Sue is a designer and technologist based in New York City. Her expanded practice involves archival projects, technocritical writing, performative lectures, design commissions, and close collaborations. She has lectured internationally at cultural institutions, and academic institutions, and mainstream platforms, among many others. Mindy also holds a Master in Design from Harvard's Graduate School of Design and a Bachelor of Arts in Design Media Arts from the University of California, Los Angeles, and is currently an assistant professor at Rutgers Mason Gross School of the Arts and a critic at Yale School of Art. Joining after the performative book reading, Mindy will join with Kendra Albert, who is a public interest technology lawyer with special interest in computer security law and freedom of expression. They serve as a clinical instructor at Cyberlaw Clinic at Harvard Law School, and they'll have a discussion after the reading. And then we'll have a few moments for some Q&A after that. So thank you for joining us this evening, and please welcome Mindy.
Hi, everyone. Is this mic on? Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks, Emily, for that introduction. So today I'm going to be walking you through the Cyberfeminism Index, which I have before me. This book is a source book. It's a chronology that's annotated, and it's also a collection of online activism and net art from the past 3 decades, structured as an index of indexes. And I'll walk you through what that means. But before we get there, we might ask, what is cyberfeminism? So this word historically has a lot of different definitions and really encouraged the mutation of those definitions. If you were to ask me, I would describe it by breaking apart the word itself. So this prefix cyber first emerged in Norbert Wiener's cybernetics of the 1940s. Are people familiar with this field of study? A lot of nodding heads. Then we see cyber affixed to space to become cyberspace in William Gibson's science fiction novel Neuromancer. Have people read this novel? So Gibson's cyberspace was important for a lot of reasons. It kind of predicted the sensory networked online landscapes that are very much in conversation today. But it also was very much characterized by the male gaze. So you have fembots and cyberbabes and depictions of women in robotic or assistant-like roles. So when cyber was fixed to feminism, this was done by 2 distinct parties, unbeknownst to the other. The first was the Australian art collective VNS Matrix, and the second was the British cultural theorist Sadie Plant. By bringing together these seemingly disparate word parts, it was almost an oxymoron or a provocation. How could feminists or women or marginalized communities shape what cyberspace might be? And we see a lot of examples in this book that range from techno-dystopic to techno-utopic and all of the blurriness in between. The sticker itself comes from the website of the Old Boys Network. So this was a website of the first international cyberfeminist collective, the Old Boys Network, from the page of Helene von Oldenburg, in which she asked the public what they thought cyberfeminism might be. And at that time, in the 90s, it was met with a lot of confusion, as seen by this robust pie chart. But even then, rather than clarifying what the term might be, they instead wrote the 100 antitheses, which instead gave 100 poetic, playful, and multilingual definitions as to what cyberfeminism was not, rather than what it was, I would say in the attempts to be more inclusive and adaptable. This book is also the edited hard copy of a soft copy called CyberFeminismIndex.com. So this website came out in 2020 in collaboration with Angeline Meitzler, Kabraskowski, and Janine Rosen. It was commissioned by Rhizome at the New Museum, and it really serves as the living complement to this book. So typically we see websites as ephemeral, mutable, and oftentimes less legitimate than their printed counterparts, which are seen as immutable and perhaps more legitimizing, more authoritative. In this case, we're trying to kind of flip that on its head. So the website will really serve as the living index, crowdsourced in perpetuity. A lot of our decisions for how we built the website and designed it was really following rules of posterity and how it can live online as long as possible. And the book then acts as a snapshot of the website's mutation. So even since we froze the manuscript, we froze the website in, I think, 2021 to create the manuscript for this book. And since then, we've already gone 300 additional entries onto the website. So you might have seen in that video, if you don't want to purchase this book, you can also select your own entries from the website and print out your own reader to create a snapshot or trail of your own. This book is also an interface filled with hyperlinks that will connect you with complementary entries and encourage nonlinear reading. Those look like these green pills, which are embedded in each of the excerpts. We might associate the hyperlink with a digital link, but its precursors were actually analog. Things like indexes, bibliographies, footnotes, all of these things served as inspiration for the digital hyperlink. So in entry 146, Cyberfeminism, Connectivity, Critique, and Creativity, the authors Renata Klein and Susan Hawthorne in 1999 in their author's notes describes the cross-reference as a hypertextual link. And then throughout the book's pages, in the margins, you have these eye icons that push and pull you to different parts of the book with complementary or juxtaposed themes. If you were to follow a path of these cross-references in this book, which is essentially my own curatorial trail, that hyperlink learning trail might read something like this. Cyberfeminism is a mutating word with a nebulous history. Its evolution is less a single root system with multiple branches than a network of entangled rhizomes, constantly and multidirectionally moving. Virginia Barrett of the Australian art collective VNS Matrix has described cyberfeminism as anti-genealogical, anti-authorial, and a hostile mucus, never faithful to any origins. Cross-reference 8. VNS Matrix, 1991. The most consistent VNS Matrix genesis story is that VNS Matrix crawled out of the cyber swamp in the particularly hot summer of 1991, and via an aesthetics of slime initially generated as porn by women for women. VNS Matrix forged an unholy alliance with technology and its machines and spewed forth a blasphemous text which was the birth of cyberfeminism. VNS Matrix was on a mission to hijack the toys from techno-cowboys and remap cyberculture with a feminist bent. This is one story. There are also stories about a slime consciousness operating via spiral space. Cross-reference 181. (181) Tales from the Puppet Mistress, Gash Girl, 2000. Years after losing my machine virginity to a Mac 512K, I have slipped through the reality grid into the clear, violent haze of spiral space. Desire. I slide through the luminous screen to inhabit the spaces between words. The keyboard is constantly sticky. Madness. An erotically reconstructed a replicant, my biocode is being rewritten. This is better than any drug. Cross-reference 646. (646) Disquartizadora, Ripper. Mestiza of the southern pussy, meat of a pussy that expels word vomit, conserved by death and disgust of the colonization representing an ancestral systemic violation in live meat. I do not feel pride because I was born full of prejudices. No Man's Land, cross-reference 95. (95) Confessions of a Webback, Guillermo Gomez Peña and Evanthea Shipstead, 1997. You call yourself a webback. Do you see yourself as an intruder on the net? Yes, the number of Latino students, artists, and activists on the net is minute. But we want to participate in the national and cultural debates, and many are permeated by technology. I consider myself a coyote, a smuggler of ideas. We want net inhabitants to get used to a new cultural sensibility, but we do encounter the linguistic border patrol. So, as you can see, the primary index that we're in feels kind of like an encyclopedia. And similar to reading an encyclopedia, you likely wouldn't do that cover to cover. You might open the book at random, find an entry that resonates with you. In this book, you can find associations on the page, or you can use these cross-references to hop to different parts of the book, surfing the book, let's say. If you want a guided tour, there's also a section of collections, where we ask different artists, activists, scholars, and collectives to create a theme, like Indigenous Futurism, in which they selected 10 to 20 entries on that theme. So here you can see Scawanati's tour of Indigenous Futurism in this book. Scawanati is largely known as the first Indigenous net artist currently based in Montreal. If you have a specific entry in mind, you can refer to the index of titles or the index of people. But if you're looking for some more serendipitous discovery, there's the index of images. All New Gen, VNS Matrix, 1992. Sabotage the databanks of Big Daddy mainframe. Your guides through the contested zone are renegade DNA sluts. The most wicked is Circuit Boy, a dangerous techno bimbo. Be prepared to question your gendered construction. Genital Panic, Merry Magic 2020. We must reconsider the normative body and how disobedient bodies are already pathologized. From the medicalization of infants born of ambiguous genitalia to the disqualification of intersex athletes on the basis of biology, these guidelines matter. They determine how we are policed and how we are surveilled. The Black Trans Archive, Danielle Brathwaite-Shirley, 2020. Welcome to the Pro-Black, Pro-Trans Archive. This interactive archive was made to store and center Black trans people, to preserve our experiences, our thoughts, our feelings, our lives, to remember us even when we are at risk of being erased. So when you enter this online site, you have three options. The first is if you're Black and trans, the second is if you're trans, and the third is if you're cis. And depending on your selection, you would have access to a different body of content inside this online space. Time Traveler, Skawanati, 2008. This is a website from the future. Watch for upcoming episodes in which Hunter Deerhouse sails to Europe with Pocahontas in AD 1615, aids and abets the Dakota Sioux Uprising of 1862, and finds true love in the Kanawake Mohawk Territory in 2009. So what you're seeing here is a trailer of a machinima. A machinima is a portmanteau of machine and cinema. So these were often plays or films that took place within video games whose recording ended up as video art pieces. And you can watch all 6 episodes of Skawanati's Time Traveler TM on their site. Afro Cyber Resistance, Tabitha Razaire, 2014. We need to quickly snap out of the Web 2.0 fantasy of the internet as a promised land. Whatever visions that ideologically shaped this technology at the beginning of the development of computers have now successfully been structurally organized to serve the primary interests of North American governmental bodies and the commercial interests of the world's wealthiest companies. The Bitch Mutant Manifesto, VNS Matrix, 1996. Your fingers probe my neural network. The tingling sensation in the tips of your fingers are my synapses responding to your touch. It's not chemistry, it's electric. Don't ever stop fingering my separating holes, extending my oozing boundary. But in spiral space, there is no they, there is only us. Suck my code. Daddy Residency, Nahi Kim, 2019. I plan to have a baby after 7 years by artificial insemination. And I'd like to have a variety of companions for that rigorous but invaluable parenting experience. So I'm launching this open call for daddy residents who want to raise the baby with me for a certain amount of time. The application deadline is July 31st, 2025. So you still have about 2 years to apply to be Nahi's baby daddy. Okay, last but not least, the Old Boys Network, 1997. The Old Boys Network is regarded as the first international cyberfeminist alliance. Normally, the term Old Boys Network is used as a metaphor to describe an informal interrelation of men. Nowadays, the Old Boys Network may be used for a dangerous cyberfeminist virus. So I wanted to just quickly walk through how this project came to be over the past 4.5 years. I'm gonna do a very fast version just for the sake of time. But one of the first things that we tried was to create an open source, open access spreadsheet. One of the first people I spoke with was Judy Malloy, who wrote another compendium called Women, Art, and Technology. She introduced the binary between yak and hack. Yak meaning theory, yak, 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 like talking. Hack like practice, and how theory and practice are often very entangled. So in this spreadsheet, even as you can see the categories and media up at the top, you'll see that things don't fit neatly into individual rows and columns. In using these kinds of predetermined categories, it prevented the blurriness for the author or the creator to create a new term of their own and or self-identify how they wanted to be categorized. So when we moved into the second container, which was the website you saw earlier, we actually removed all of the categorization. When Angeline and I were working on the second container of the Cyberfeminism Index, this website, our primary question was, how do websites age? And according to Forbes, the average lifespan of a website is about 2.5 years. And by that measure, our site would already be down because it came out in 2020, wow. When we were looking at references, luckily we had a lot to refer to. This site came out in the 90s, 1997. It was hard quoted by Cornelia Solfrank. The URL has changed, but when you go to this site now, it still works perfectly. And we might be to hypothesize why that's the case. It's using a lot of system defaults, like it's using primarily HTML and CSS. Your header 1, header 2 list items is using form fields like this navigation dropdown as your nav bar. It's also using CSS Blue. Also, fun fact, this site uses Arial, which is one of the few system fonts that was co-designed by a woman, Patricia Saunders for IBM in the early 1980s. That's also why we use Arial on our website and in the printed book, Arial Narrow, just because we needed a bit more space. So our sites also is using these kinds of drop-downs and default elements. While it appears to be a fairly standard table, upon interaction, it's made to feel unusual. So your selections are added to the side panel, which we call the learning trail. We don't store any of your IP information or what you select, but we do store how many entries were selected at certain times. And as mentioned earlier, you can then download this as your own PDF or reader. When we were then transposing that website into a manuscript for this book, my collaborator Laura Combs and I hired Lily Healy, who is a programmer at The New Yorker. She actually scripts every single weekly issue of The New Yorker because it's highly templated and they come out very quickly. So we actually followed a similar approach and we scripted this entire book. So what you see is a Google Doc, which is the edited transcription of what you see on the website. We color-coded it so you have red titles, blue annotations, green metadata. Here you can see Lily's cursor, and she's downloading this Google Doc as an XML file. So she's opening an InDesign file that appears to be blank, but it comes pre-tagged with Laura's character styles, object styles, grids, fonts, etc. But when she drags in the XML, it appears to magically populate around 400 pages of this book. If only it was that easy. So the primary index of this book is roughly this thick. And they're all flowing columns. So this first column on page 1 is attached to the last column on page 422. So every time we typeset this column, added an image, caption, got rid of a widow, it would push every subsequent column across 400 pages. So we actually found that it was faster to re-script the index anytime there was a typo or some sort of error, rather than having to push pixels in InDesign. Though we did also do that too. We typeset for about 3 months after we had the tightest manuscript possible. I think this really goes to show that even when we're trying to create efficient technological systems, it often requires the manual support of a human hand, often rendered invisible. There's more I could say here, but I wanted to just quickly end with the acknowledgements. So this is a title sequence. Typically, these are reserved for the ends of films or videos, but it also goes to show the huge network of people that go to make projects like these possible. Books are essentially examples of world building. So we see credits for the front and back matter, like the forward, afterward, and collections. The referred by are all of the people that I first called on the phone to help create that open source or open access spreadsheet. So this was essentially a spiderweb effect that referred me to others. And the submitted by are all of the people who submitted entries into cyberfeminismindex.com, which at this point now has several hundred more people. A huge consideration for Laura and I was, if this is a co-authored volume, then why is my name on the cover? And when we were doing some material research into other large compendiums and history books, we found that the byline was often very invisible or very hidden away or quite invisible. So what this almost suggested was the book you were looking at was some sort of objective truth or singular history. So we thought by very much foregrounding an authoring editor, that might suggest that this is one compendium of cyberfeminism alongside many others published earlier that's very much shaped by my subjective bias. So it's a multiplicitous history that we're trying to embrace here. Not only does it people might think it's giving someone to celebrate, but rather it's giving a clear person to blame. And blame they have, because whenever there's an error on the website or in the book, I get emails and I welcome them. Some of these are, please remove me from this index, I don't identify as this genre, or please add me. And I'll often have to ask, how might you define this term that allows me to constantly mutate my definition too? Another great thing about this type of project, which really feels like an example of a gathering practice, it's bringing together a lot of disparate entries, material gathering. It also gives space for social gatherings like the one we're in now. So I wanted to give a huge shout out to the MIT Lists team, Emily and Cassidy, thank you so much, as well as the AV team in the back, Barry and Richard, and of course, our next panelist, Kendra Albert, who I will introduce now. Oh, thank you. So Kendra Albert is a public interest technology lawyer with a special interest in computer security law and freedom of expression. They serve as a clinical instructor at the Cyberlaw Clinic at Harvard Law School, where they teach students to practice law by working with pro bono clients. Kendra is also the founder and director of the Initiative for Representative First Amendment. They serve on the board of the ACLU of Massachusetts and as the chair of the board of the Tor Project and provide support as a legal advisor for hacking hustling. In their free time, Kendra enjoys giving away other people's money, playing video games, and making people in power uncomfortable. I'm excited to have this conversation. Thank you.
You can, I guess you can clap again.
Yeah.
Thank you. I feel like that book is a pretty hard act to follow. So I hope I can live up to the sort of forebears that you have already introduced us to.
I think what's been exciting about these types of events, it's allowed me to pull people with very similar research queries in different regions that we're in as a way to dive deep, because the book does provide a pretty expanded overview. So in this panel, we're going to really dig deep into gender as technology. And Kendra, luckily, is an expert in various aspects of this space. So all that said, you teach an undergrad course at Harvard in the studies of women, gender, and sexuality called Gender and Technology, Gender as Technology. We typically understand technology to have a digital connotation, but how might you expand our definition of technology? And in doing so, how can gender act as a technology?
Thank you for the question. And I should mention, I'm actually teaching this course for the first time this spring. So we'll see how it goes.
This is our trial.
Yeah, I'm trying out my pitch on all of y'all. Registration's in a couple weeks. I hear you can cross-register. So, but I kind of became really obsessed with this idea of gender as a technology because I read this piece a long time ago, a 2009 essay by Beth Coleman, who's like a media artist and a musician. And in it, the essay is called Race as Technology. And she sort of talks about in that piece, what would it mean if we approach race as a technology? And I'm just going to read a little bit of it because she says it in a way that I think really captured my imagination and maybe also yours. So she says, the word technology first appears in the English language in 1615, meaning a discourse or treatise on art or arts, the scientific study of the practical or industrial arts. And she points out that technology is actually, in that historical definition, the study of stuff, not, a thing itself. But she goes on to say, in extending the function of techne to race, Greek is not my thing, so just, bear with me. I create a collision of value systems. In this formulation, race exists as if it were on par with a hammer or a mechanical instrument. Denaturing it from its historical roots, race can then be freely engaged with as a productive tool. For the moment, let us call race as technology, the concept of race as technology, a disruptive technology that changes the terms of engagement with an all too familiar system of representation and power. So Coleman sort of uses the concept of thinking about race as a technology as a way to imagine like a different potential future for race. She says the goal of thinking about race as technology is greater mobility for the subject and for society, more freeness. And I read her piece and it blew my mind. And then I think I kind of just became really interested in what would it look like if we thought about gender and we talked about gender the way we talk about technology. And Coleman's sort of talking about it both from a kind of like, I don't want to say mechanistic, but a very, what does it do? Like a productive tool, and a way of sort of making strange something that seemed familiar. And I think especially in kind of gender studies, and a lot of the spaces that I spend a lot of time in, we think we sometimes know what we're talking about when we're talking about gender. And I feel like a big theme of my career is I'm still not certain. But it also seemed like a way to focus on what identity categories do in the world, like what is gender doing, which, apologies to Judith Butler, but also in a way that allows us to sort of change our relationship to understanding it. So Coleman says an agent can judge the strategic value of one mode of representation over another. Of course, like race, gender, these categories, they have political economy, right? I'm not sort of imagining like, a world where these things don't mean anything. But I think I wanted to sort of turn some of the kinds of tools of critical technology studies, of science and technology studies on some of the sort of concepts of gender that felt like I hadn't looked at them in that way before, with this more of a focus on what they do than like, oh, what are they? Or what do they mean? And I think that's something I'm really excited about in the class. I think it also, one theme that I think about a lot in my work is how technologies can change gender. And I think that this is something that can sound, for gender studies people, this often sounds totally normal. And for people in many technology spaces, this sounds bonkers. And I know this in part because I gave a talk last year in a computer security class at MIT. And I got asked to give a talk on gender insecurity. And I think, my friend who invited me was kind of thinking like, wow, we'll have someone talk about like gender gaps in security knowledge or something. And I was like, well, I'm not going to talk about that. Like that's just not a thing I'm interested in talking about. So I ended up talking about how TSA body scanners, based on the work of Sasha Costanza-Chuk, who used to be who used to be here and is now at Northeastern. TSA body scanners, if you go through the airport, you do this thing, they're actually the person who's standing there, the TSA agent, actually assigns you to a blue or pink button, right, when you go through. And that's the sort of body form your body is matched against, the thing that causes you to get an error or not. Okay, so there's like a gender bias in technology problem. There's sort of a vision of what blue or pink looks like in those objects. But the thing that I think is interesting to talk about there is actually that means that TSA body scanners change gender. And what I mean by that is I'm sort of engaged in this like slow kind of steady process of every time I go through a TSA body scanner, I think about like, like what am I wearing? Like what combination of things that I'm wearing are going to lead to them picking a particular button, one or the other, right? If I'm wearing a mask, then maybe I'm more likely to get them pick the blue button. If I'm wearing shorts and I haven't shaved my legs because I don't shave my legs, maybe they'll pick the blue button, versus if I'm wearing tighter jeans, maybe they'll pick the pink one. So my decision making as I go through that process is actually changing my gender expression in a very particular way. And I don't think that, I guess my own personal take on the like what is gender thing is I don't think you can really talk about changing gender expression without changing some part of the concept of gender. So I'm going to stop there because I could go on about this literally forever, and I probably will. For an entire
semester.
But I think the last thing I will say is that in some ways it's sort of like my own particular attempt to sort of pull gender from this kind of like squishy, soft, feminine category, which is there's nothing wrong with that, but into this category of technology that people understand and appreciate and build knowledge about in a very different way.
Yeah. This really reminds me of Sadie Plant, who again was one of the people who coined cyberfeminism, wrote this great book called Zeros and Ones, very important read. But she describes a lot of critique about zeros and ones was that it was pushing forward this idea of gender essentialism, which proposes that men and women have very distinct innate traits, so traits that you were born with. And she was arguing that gender essentialism is real, not because we're necessarily born with them, but because we're socialized in a structure where we learn a code of how we practice this thing. So even before, when you talk about gender as doing, it's really about this active practice. So even if we might have been indoctrinated into gender essentialist norms, you have to kind of learn something to unlearn it. And maybe that's what we're trying to complicate here. Also, that Sasha piece is in the Cyberfeminism Index, so it's nice to mention.
I did not do that on purpose. I'm not specifically trying to name drop pieces that are in the book. It's just going to happen. So
there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
You've also published a couple of papers on non-binary folks and technologies, specifically smart scales and electronic health records with your collaborator, Maggie Delano. What are some ways that non-binary and transgender people are excluded from health technologies? And in addition, how are more people that we think might be more mainstream also excluded from these health technologies?
Thank you for the question. So the story of this paper, of this sort of line of research, starts in the way that I think a lot of my stories start, which is like, wow, that technology is really fucked up. I should probably write about it, which it turns out I was given the advice by a senior scholar that spite is a pretty good motivator for a research agenda. And I found that to be true in my own personal experience. The first piece that we wrote about this topic was actually about smart scales. And the piece is called This Whole Thing Smacks of Gender, because my deal with my co-author, Maggie, was that I would write a paper with them if I got to name it. And so I named it after a drill tweet, which, that was a choice that I made. It's now the second or like third like search result for that phrase, which I think just confuses a lot of people as to why like an article that's on like an ACM article is like shows up when they're searching for a drill tweet. But our work basically focuses on the way in which, for some, in many circumstances, non-binary people experience like clear what's called disaffordances, right? Like you can't use the thing. It'll require a binary gender for you to like use the tool. And that's what we found in the case of Smart Scales, the one that we study, literally has a thing in the app where it's like you have to pick like a pant-wearing person or a skirt-wearing person. And it's not a euphemism. There's no like labels. It's just the two icons, which I was like, I don't know what to do here. But we sort of wanted to look into like, okay, like how does a non-binary person decide what to pick with this technology? And that turned out to be really complicated because the underlying technology that the Smart Scale is based on, which is called bioimpedance analysis, is actually based on a series of regression equations that are based on a series of studies that only gather what was probably binary. It's unclear if it's binary gender data or binary sex data. So the answer is we actually have no idea how, body composition like maps onto non-binary people because the underlying sort of research just is not necessarily there. And what we argue in that piece, and Mindy, what your question kind of gets at, is actually that as a non-binary person who's using that technology, it's visually obvious to you that you don't fit into the pant-wearing, skirt-wearing category. Like it's just like, oh, I don't know which one to pick. But there's actually huge populations of people for whom the primary algorithms is like maybe being a little bit like over like exaggerated. They're equations, they're regression equations. There's like a little offset where they add a plus or a minus depending if it's like male or female. Those equations were based on data sets that were exclusionary in all kinds of ways, right? They're primarily Caucasian, actually primarily younger, so the technology works less well on people who are probably less well on people who are not white, people who are not European, people who are not who are older. But it's actually not obvious from the interface that any of that's true. The thing that's obvious is that if you're a non-binary person, you got to pick. And so we actually, in that work, describe it as sort of this iceberg where non-binary people are at the top of the iceberg. You can tell that it doesn't work. But there's actually all of this huge population lower than that of people who, the technology is not going to work as well but it's not visible in the same way. And, one of the things that we kind of have talked about in a lot of our work is how the part of this has to do with the way in which this information about people is gathered, which assumes that like these social constructions of gender are like, first of all, internally are coherent, which they're not, but also are sort of like will map on across time, or that, this subpopulation that they actually sampled on is sort of representative of a broader whole. And so I think it's a critique that I think is true across a lot of health tech, which is just that, we don't, there are folks this isn't going to work on, and it may not be obvious for a while. And another example actually is, as people may have followed during sort of peak pandemic times, there was a series of conversations around pulse oximeters, which basically shine out, it's meant to get your O2, your oxygen levels, but it shines a light through your finger. I am simplifying radically. Maggie is the technical co-author who builds medical devices. I simplify radically, that's my job. And it works less well on people with more melanin in their skin, which means that it thinks, and like that had very specific, very negative outcomes, at times when everyone was saying like, oh, like put it on your finger, measure your O2 level before you go to the hospital, right? So when we think about health tech, like part of why I talk about health tech is because the stakes are real and very visible to people. The stakes are real for all kinds of other technology too, but the dramatic impact is like there and visible in a way that I think can help folks who wouldn't otherwise understand why it matters to build inclusive technologies, or even that's like makes it sound like kind of like nice to like actually think about building technologies that work for people to do that.
Yeah, and I think that as you're saying, it's not only health tech, it's really all tech. Like Currently, I'm writing a field report on the blockchain, and it's the same exact space. You can find this in AI too. Like, pick a technology, pick a societal system, and you will find this type of discrimination. To kind of pivot a bit, work on the internet or those that use new technologies is oftentimes quite ephemeral. So we're constantly facing link rot, software and hardware degradation, something that was a huge consideration when trying to capture these for the Cyberfeminism Index. So with your work at the Software Preservation Network, what are some of the legal barriers to preserving software? And are there strategies of how we might preserve ephemeral artifacts?
I love this question in part because it reveals why I feel like I'm an excellent conversational partner for Mindy on this work, because I don't just pick one thing and stick to it. I'm just like, I like everything. Let's talk about software preservation. Yeah. And I'm going to turn it around and ask Mindy a question about the Cyberfeminism Index after that. So if you're like, yeah, I mean, online preservation's a freaking nightmare. Remember many years ago when I started by working on video games, video game preservation. And I remember I read this report by this guy named Henry Lowen, who has now become like a collaborator and a colleague. I do not think he has anything in the index, although I could be wrong. And he wrote, like, basically copyright law takes the already difficult matter of preservation of online games and makes it fundamentally impossible. And he was talking about a specific provision of copyright law. But I think that, one of the challenges as an attorney that I face a lot of is, while not falling into, I think, the kind of like cyber libertarian utopian like bullshit that I think you heard disclaimed earlier, understanding how the law can get in the way of people who want to do things like preserve works, like, collect them. And, there are a lot of barriers, like, resources, technical knowledge, the underfunding of arts and humanities institutions, right? Like, we could go on forever. But I do think even when you get beyond those, with online preservation, there are a series of sort of unresolved or often difficult to resolve questions about how copyright law and other sort of laws that apply on the internet interact with the sort of very everyday practices of archiving. And frankly, I think the people who have been most successful at it have just like not spent a lot of time worrying about it, right? Like, and in some ways, like, I feel like as someone who works on software preservation as a lawyer, like, there's times where I'm like, I just really wish people wouldn't talk to me because I don't want to have to tell them that they shouldn't do the thing that I actually want them to do, which is preserve the works, right? In terms of sort of strategies, right? I think there are a lot of them, right? People talk about sort of migrating stuff to other formats. There's a lot of work on emulation, which I think has been relatively successful at kind of making it possible to kind of to go back to see works in the way that they were originally viewed, because it turns out if you open AutoCAD files in a version that's 2 years later than they were originally produced, and they look different, and that's kind of a problem if you want to study architectural history, for example. But I think that, it is such a challenge in part because, for so many of the works that actually we want to keep and we think are important, like, the person who created them at the time might not think of them as important, right? Like, how many times have all of us gone back and like, had something like that lives rent-free in their brain that's just something somebody said on the internet in like passing a long time ago, and you're like, this is really important to me, and that person may like have forgotten about it, have deleted it, right? So I think that in some ways, like, part of it is this sort of idea that, oftentimes, folks feel a very real need and desire to go back and get permission to sort of, check in with people. But the people who maybe produce these cultural works in the first place, like, that's not their relationship to the work anymore. Yeah. And that brings me to wanting to hear you talk a little bit, because we talked a little bit before this, about sort of the process of like thinking about that in the context of the Cyberfeminism Index, because, so many of the works that I think you highlight, like, I don't know whether at the time people thought like, this is something that's gonna end up in this canon or anti-canon. Like, how did people respond to like you kind of wanting to include their works?
I guess to answer this in a roundabout way, when we were turning this into a book, my publishers wanted to call this the Cyberfeminism Archive. And I was like, this is not an archive, this is an index. And I think there are clear distinctions between the two. An archive is a way to kind of bring things together, which this does in a way, but there's also kind of like a wall around this. And there's a capital A archive typically has some sort of generational preservation method intact. An index points outward, which is why I like the term anti-canon instead, or something that's quite porous, because everything you see on the website or in the book, excluding things like manuscripts, are often excerpts. It's never the work in full. So what we often do then is try to fortify the outward link. So if we're linking to a NetArt piece, if it's degraded and long gone, we'll find the original on Internet Archive's Wayback Machine or on Rhizome's Conifer. Maybe Conifer is more of an emulation tool, whereas Wayback Machine uses a series of bots and screenshots to capture websites across time. If it was a PDF, I'll download it off JSTOR and have multiple copies and link to all of those copies. So it's really about trying to create this like bilateral way to start in the index, move outward, come back in, and etc. When we were trying to capture or collect some of the works for this index, when we were trying to email people to ask for permission, most of these emails were from the 90s and no longer working. So we also had to do this roundabout thing of trying to trace who this person was now at their current institution or their personal site or their colleagues or etc. So
Google stalking every single author.
Every single person. Yeah, the image permissions for this book was crazy. There's about 800 images. We had to email about 1,500 people or accounts. That said, it's a very imperfect system, right? There's a lot of people we couldn't get in touch with. There's a lot of people where we linked to a work, but it was actually malformed because the browser space had changed so much. If you're using an emulator, you have to kind of pick an environment that would make the work work. So there's a lot of obstacles to this, but I also think, especially at some place like MIT, there are a lot of initiatives that try to make this a bit more streamlined. I think it also points to this grassroots effort of collecting is really important because then you can actually choose what you think is worthwhile to preserve and not have to rely on an institution to tell you that something is worthy. So all of these things really take an individual effort, which is why I really like this download feature,
Yeah.
amongst other things.
Can I ask you one more question before we see if the audience has Q&A?
Yes, I wanted to ask one other question about sex work, but you go and then I'll go and then we'll go to that.
All right. Okay, you go and then I'll go and then we'll. We had a plan.
We had a plan, but it's too long.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump ahead a bit. Yeah.
All right.
So Ali Eve Knox, who's a sex worker, as part of Spank Chain and other initiatives, describes sex workers as canaries in the coal mine. So they often push forward the development of new tech, but oftentimes don't get attribution. And a lot of things that are in mainstream use fall into this camp. So the reason we used VHS instead of Betamax was because VHS was much cheaper and porn companies were using that to produce films. Even Spank Chain, which is a sex worker owned cryptocurrency, was one of the first cryptocurrencies that was actually actively used as a resource rather than just a speculation. Advertising models on tube sites like Pornhub were then models that were recreated on tube sites like YouTube. But I'm curious if you can speak to other examples where the adult industry has pushed forward new tech.
Honestly, this is a really good question to end on. So I'm going to pull something from the first question, which is to say, I think the technology that I actually think of a lot when I think about like sex work now, and we're talking about this in part because a lot of my research and work focuses on sex workers and sex worker community activism around access to online platforms. it really makes me think about something my friend and colleague Danielle Blunt, who's one of the organizers and collective members of Hacking Hustling, which is a collective, sex worker collective that works on issues of technology.
Also in the book.
Also.
Yeah.
It's just a collection of friends. One thing she says is that like community is the most powerful technology of all. And I actually think that, like, for me, I think there are, we can talk about, and you talked about like VHS versus Betamax, and it's like totally this like a big example. Mm-hmm. But I think for me, like watching and working on sex work issues since the passage of FOSTA, which is sort of a law that made a pretty big set of changes for how sex workers were operating online. A lot of the sort of technologies that I've seen people really use effectively is the power of sort of community and like not organizing and having conversations in spaces that are not necessarily like publicly accessible, but sort of mobilizing through like the connections to people. Because that's, for folks who are criminalized, like many sex workers in the US or who exist in proximity to criminalized industries, like the way you survive harm is not, necessarily fancy encryption on your phone or like, just the right tool or whatever. It's actually like the people who are going to call you and make sure you're safe. They're going to, the joke is like pass around the same $10, over and over again to a new GoFundMe every time, right? The technology that keeps us safe is actually like the community and the people who are doing that work together. Yeah. And I think like that, that frame of kind of changing how we think about what like, oh, we need to develop technologies to keep us safe. Like actually that technology has been there and people have been using it for a long time across a lot of mediums.
Absolutely. And I think that when we talk about like sex work and technology, when they're using more digital forms of technology, it's often because their work on mainstream platforms is so policed, as you're saying. So even these ideas of community, oftentimes these were happening in online spaces. So one of the first like forums was Redbook, which was essentially a digital black book, right? Places where sex workers could add content about clients that were safe, regions, different tips. So this is similar to Stripper Web, which actually I think just went down this year after being self-funded and managed for about over 15 years or something. Or even the Red Umbrella. So this was a sex worker owned and operated server to host the sites of other sex workers in order to keep these things working without fear of them being taken down. So yes, absolutely. Community and conversation, also supplemented on digital tools because that's often how we communicate now.
All right.
It's 7:01, so we're 1 minute past, but we'd love to open it up to a couple of questions if anyone has one. And I think we have a couple of mics floating around. There's one right up here in the front. Here.
Do you have a mic or should we?
Oh, is there a mic?
Nope.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Hello. So after doing all this work of indexing all these examples of, I think you used the word world building, all these spaces like bi, queer, trans, Black people, for people who are marginalized in physical space, how do you think we can bring those digital spaces that, we're working so hard to like preserve and exist in abundance, as we can see through your novel? How can we bring that into a physical space?
I mean, I do think this network effect is real. Like the other day, I talked to Latasha Alcindor, who's the head of community at Zora, which is a NFT platform, but she founded Zoratopia, which was essentially Zoom calls that onboarded BIPOC people into Web3. And in the beginning, it was like double digit, and now they've onboarded over like 4,000 people who have gone on to start their own initiatives at other Web3 companies. So I do think this is happening really, really quickly. And they're also like churning out these superstars that kind of act as an amplifier or like a flame, perhaps. So I think visibility is a huge part of it. But yeah, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I think the thing I sort of have tried to assume is that just because I don't know about the thing doesn't mean it's not happening.
Yeah.
Right. And that I think like, I have a very particular vantage point and there's stuff that I see a lot of, but there's also many initiatives initiatives makes it sound much more like people doing lots of cool shit that I'm never going to see. And actually I'm not the audience for, and I don't need to see. Right. And so I think one of the things that I've sort of come to think about a lot is how do I make myself accessible to folks who might need support or might need, help from a lawyer, because that's one of the things I actually do, right? Who might be building these communities, and then just let them do their thing, then rather than thinking that I have to be involved in some way or present in some way. And that's not to sort of abdicate responsibility for kind of building like the world we want to see, but also to say that sometimes I think as, technologists or folks who sort of work in technology spaces, we do have this habit of kind of thinking of ourselves as like the ones who are going to make it happen, when really often there are people making it happen already, which I think is such a theme of some of the things that are present in the index, which is that people were doing this stuff,
Yeah, they really were. Across the world. One of the people in this book, Radhika Gujala, she co-coined Cyberfeminism 2.0. There's a lot of different branches, let's say. But in it, she talks about how this use of marginalized or subaltern is all about perspective. Like if you are in a marginalized group and that's your primary world, that is the altern, right? Sub is just because you're placed in conjunction with some other mainstream that's kind of pushing these things on top of you. So I think that it also reminds me of this phrase, the explanatory comma.
Yeah.
When you're using a term and you have to explain it for a larger audience, sometimes it's perceived as generous, but it's also indicating to the smaller niche that already understood what it was, that this is no longer for us. It's meant for this mainstream. So it's totally valid to just make work that's specific to your community and not really worry about it trying to hit this larger space. And I think this book is also part of that, right? Like, this is not going to be a New York Times bestseller, but I wanted it to be very relevant for people who use the internet in a critical way, right? Not necessarily gender studies, but trying to make it feel like it's a technocritical document that people can refer to. So I think just understanding what you're trying to aim for is really important. But thanks for that question.
That's a good question. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the reading and the discussion. It's been wonderful so far. My question has to do with language and how not just the index itself, but cyberfeminism as it exists deals with language, and not just the languages that you think of as widely spoken, like Spanish or French, but really thinking of languages that are not written, and feminism that is not written, and like that affects how it can be transmitted over the internet, and how the index accounts for that, but the field as a whole does as well.
That's a really important question and something we've honestly been struggling with. So to zoom out a bit, in the intro, I describe how cyberfeminism is an imperfect umbrella term. And this is because, depending on who you speak with, when I was trying to find these entries, if you looked up Korean cyberfeminism, I couldn't find that much. But then when a Korean scholar told me, oh, in Korea it's called netfemi. So I realized, depending on the region, there's a different term that emerges. So in Latin America, Mexico City primarily, they use hack feminista, not cyberfeminist.
Frankly, hack feminista sounds cooler.
So cooler. And there's, of course, contemporary versions of this too. Like, people are always creating new genres. Legacy Russell created glitch feminism. Laborio Kubanix created xenofeminism. Radhika Gajala created cyberfeminism 2.0. Like there's so many different versions. And this book was trying to bring them all together as a way to kind of show the through lines of a critical use of technology from a feminist perspective. In terms of the non-written, this was really difficult because when we were trying to find examples in China, for example, it was so hard to find records of these kinds of things. And because the book structure is really based on excerpts to show the voice of the person who was involved, finding documents of these things, they would just get wiped really fast. So we're trying to introduce a new thing where we can actually lean more on oral histories or more ephemeral things that aren't like direct markers of the exact moment as a way to suggest, or just as a talking point to start to track this kind of history. Because in so many areas, the internet was adopted in different regions at different times, and there's all different forms of policing. So we really do need to create a more of a wide-reaching response. And at this point, the Chinese examples always come from printed books. There's not many like net art examples, let's say. So yes, important question, and unfortunately not a clean answer because we're still working on trying to figure that out. But thank you. One more if we have it, or we can talk casually at the front of the stage if we want to close out. One more right in the front. Maybe this will be our last one. Sorry, I'm making a lot of like noise.
I mean, maybe
I think it's this. Okay.
You mentioned the complexities of taking a digital index and translating it into a physical source. And you also mentioned that like since starting this project, there's been 300 plus more entries. How does a second iteration or, you know, a second kind of parallel version of this, like how do you do that when there's so much complexity to a project like this?
We'll come back in 5 years, volume 2.
So my background's in design. I used to do a lot of websites and like interactive installations. And from this experience, I just know books last longer. Even if we've made decisions to make the website as like fortified as possible, just in case we wanted to have this kind of like backup, let's say. That said, the reason why we went the official route and not the self-published route is because when I was creating the contract with my publishers, I wanted to make sure there is an ISBN and this will be stored in the Library of Congress. I think when you're creating these grassroots archives, collections, histories, you kind of have to infiltrate these institutions that have a lot of resources. And this was a way of injecting that into that space. So at least I know these 700 plus entries are preserved in some way, if for whatever reason the website goes down. That said, Rhizome is a partner, and it's also going to be stored in Artbase, which is their digital preservation arm alongside Conifer. That said, I really don't want to print a second volume. Like, I feel like this did its job. I would much rather make the print-on-demand version on the website way more robust. You can do a lot with print CSS. The way we've currently styled it is pretty light, but you can like design entire books using CSS now. And if we can format that in a way that you can just send it to like a print-on-demand generator like Lulu or Blurb, then everyone can print out however many entries they want moving forward. So that's a goal. But we'll see if anyone has a budget. It would be nice to work on different translations. Thank you so much. I think we might be at time. Yep. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Just a warm thank you to Mindy for just doing that wonderful performative reading and just like animating your text in this multi-universal way. And then also, Kendra, thank you so much for your sharing your, just being so generous with what your commentary was tonight. So thank you both. Thank you all. Yeah.
Cassidy has them. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, no.